Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth session of More Time for Books. Today is also Lag BaOmer, Chag Sameach. These Zoom sessions are among Women's League's newest programs that are meant to keep us learning and socializing with our networks and to form new networks. The last four sessions of this More Time for Books series, we talked about books adapted for film, then biography and memoir, then works of humor and satire, and then books about Israel. So today's session, we'll get into in a moment. I'm Vivian Lever, a Vice President of Women's League Reads and Chair of, a Vice President of Women's League and Chair of the Women's League Reads program, one of its educational offerings. Women's League Reads has an author interview with Goldie Goldblum, scheduled for June 2nd at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Her novel on division tells of a middle-aged Hasidic woman who tests her boundaries of individuality during a crisis. To join Women's League Reads, please send an email to Lois Silverman at lsilverman@WLCJ. Today we're going to celebrate nature through books, fiction, and nonfiction. That theme was chosen in honor of Lag BaOmer, which has multiple levels of significance. Among them is the imperative to get out into nature, into the outdoors. Joining me today in profiling books and writers are a few other book lovers. And I also hope for audience participation later in the program. We have Rachel Kamen, director of the Joseph and May Gray Cultural and Learning Center at North Suburban Synagogue, Bethel at Highland Park, Illinois. We have with us Susan Farber from Cincinnati, Ohio, who leads book clubs in the region. Sandy Carlton from Rockford, Illinois' Sisterhood at Congregation Ohave Shalom. Also, we will hear from Marjorie Furman of the Seaboard region. She chairs Women's League Social Action Committee and serves as on the Torah Fund Cabinet. I will also present a couple of books, and I'm really proud to say that two of my three daughters will be joining us for short presentations later on, Jessica Lieber and Rebecca Lieber. Both are journalists. Both have specialties in environment, climate, nature, and energy reporting. And they're avid readers and book club members. We'll end this session in an hour, and we may even go a few minutes past. So afterwards, if you may send me an email request to vlieber@wlcj.org to request a list of the books that we discussed here today. It may take a few days, and if you've requested lists before for these sessions, I will automatically send that to you. So with that, I'm going to introduce Rachel Kamen again for our first presentation. Rachel, we have to unmute you. Hi, I think you're okay now.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna share the screen. Okay, so thank you, Vivian. So as Vivian mentioned, in honor of Lag BaOmer, I thought I would present some books, fiction books with Jewish content that some more strictly than others, some a little loose, but kind of have a connection to and have strong elements of nature in the natural world. Let me just get my slides up. Okay, so, and I thought of this one right away, just looking at the cover. This drawing on the memoir of Frances Conway, Enchanted Islands by Allison Abend, is a fascinating and well-written, though very, 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 very fictionalized account that follows the daughter of Jewish immigrants as she runs away as a teenager from Minnesota to Chicago and then on to Nebraska and San Francisco, where she eventually lands a secretarial job working for Navy intelligence. There she marries, and I put that in quotes, and when you read the book, you'll understand why. She marries an undercover officer and accompanies him on a secret mission to the Galapagos Islands to spy on the Germans at the brink of World War II. Readers will be tempted to read Conway's actual memoir to learn more about this intriguing couple, the enchanted setting, and the extraordinary time. Abend's descriptions of the flora and fauna of the Galapagos Islands are exquisite, and she paints a vivid picture of what it would have been like to live on this extremely remote island in the 1930s. Einstein's theory of relativity, the 1914 eclipse, World War I, anti-Semitism, romance, adventure, Russian pogroms, and pioneering young woman surgeon are all packed into this sweeping historical novel, Abend and the Stars, by debut author Rachel Berenbaum. This book was a little dense. It's quite hefty and long, but the characters were very well developed, and Berenbaum painted a detailed picture of what it was like for a young Jewish physicist and a young Jewish female surgeon in Russia just before World War I. I found it to be a very interesting and worthwhile read. Especially since so much of the, I'd say, like European Jewish fiction we read tends to be World War II related. I thought it was interesting to read a book set just before World War I. And I also certainly learned a lot about astronomy and medicine. The research that Rachel Berenbaum did about the eclipse and the race for Einstein's theory of relativity was really just fascinating. And for each slide, you'll see I put if the author had some other books. So Alison Amend has 2 other novels, and then I also put some read-alikes. The read-alikes are not necessarily about nature and the natural world. They're just other similar books that you might enjoy if you've already read this one. And there's a couple read-alikes for Abend and the Stars also. In The Bookshop of the Brokenhearted by Robert Hillman, Tom Hope's wife, Trudy, abruptly disappears, only to return a year later pregnant with another man's child. When Trudy leaves again, Tom, a humble, unassuming farmer and handyman, raises the baby Peter on his own for several years. He's devastated when Trudy returns and takes Peter back to the Jesus Camp, a cult-like religious community where her mother and sister live. With no legal claim on the child, Tom is heartbroken until he meets Hannah Babel, a colorful, charismatic woman 12 years older than him, who opens a bookshop in their quaint backwater Australian town and hires Tom to refurbish it. Their mutual attraction is almost instant, but Hannah carries scars of her own as a Holocaust survivor who lost her husband and young son at Auschwitz. Tom and Hannah's marriage brings both of them solace until Peter escapes the commune and returns to Tom, forcing Hannah to question whether she could ever love another child, and Tom to have to choose between his marriage and his love for the boy he considers his son. This is a post-Holocaust novel with a really interesting rural Australian setting and provides a complex exploration of grief and faith and love. And I included it today because there's a lot of information about sheep farming. So that's its natural connection, and it really takes place in the middle of nowhere, Australia. The World That We Knew by Alice Hoffman, it won this year's National Jewish Book Award in the book club category. A Jewish mother in Berlin commissions a golem to accompany her daughter to safety during World War II. There's a large cast of characters, and I really liked how all the stories connected in different ways. And the elements of magical realism, which are very typical to those of us that read Alice Hoffman, reminded me of The Sisters of the Winter Wood by Rena Rosner, which I'm going to talk about next. And then the golem, of course, was very similar to Helene Wecker's Golem and the Ginny. I listened to this audiobook, and it was beautifully narrated by actress Judith Light. And I think there's plenty to discuss as a book club book. However, The Dove Keepers and The Marriage of Opposites still stand as my favorite Alice Hoffman books, personally. But in all three of these books, Hoffman's descriptive language and her descriptive language paints a vivid picture of the natural and physical settings, from the Roman siege of Masada 2,000 years ago to the island of St. Thomas in the 1800s and the forests of Europe during World War II. I think with Alice Hoffman, you read with all of your senses engaged and turned on. And then this was the book I previously mentioned, The Sisters of the Winter Woods by Rena Rosner. And this is a fairy tale that draws on history, folklore, and mythology. It's set in a woodland village on the border of Moldova and Ukraine. And Rosner, a debut novelist who also works as a literary agent for the Deborah Harris Agency in Jerusalem, follows the experiences of two teenage sisters who uncover a secret magical heritage. Alternating chapters of prose and verse help to emphasize the difference between the two sisters, who are products of an unusual mystical union between two shapeshifters, a Jewish bear and a Gentile swan. Yes, their father is a bear and their mother is a swan. Then when their parents are summoned back to their father's hometown, the girls are left alone and soon discover that they too can transform. Liba into a bear like her father and Leah into a swan like her mother. But people are going missing from the town. There are rumors of dangerous bears in the woods, and anti-Semitic sentiment is on the rise. When a seductive band of fruit peddling brothers arrive in town, Leah is unable to resist their otherworldly appeal. And to save her sister and her people, Liba must learn to accept her bear-like nature. As Publishers Weekly describes it, Rosner's fairy tale is creepy and moving by turn, full of heart, history, and enchantment. Featuring strong-willed, independent teenage protagonists, The Sisters of the Winter Wood was reviewed in School Library Journal as an adult book for teens. And while I don't typically read the fantasy genre, it really was refreshing 2 years ago to see a fantasy novel with significant Jewish content. And interestingly enough, it wasn't the only one. In 2018, the novel Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik also came out. And that's also a historical fiction fantasy novel with significant Jewish content. So if you really want something different, I really recommend The Sisters of the Winter Woods by Rena Rosner. If you're really a fantasy fan, I also recommend Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. Personally, I liked Sisters of the Winter Wood a little better. I think it's a little more accessible maybe to readers not as familiar with the genre. Set in the years leading up to World War I, so similar to A Bend in the Stars by Rachel Berenbaum, House of Gold by Natasha Solomons explores the lives, loyalties, and power of a fictional Jewish family of bankers between 1911 and 1917. But while the gold bond men are successful moneylenders and investors, extremely wealthy and integrated into the upper crust of European society, they face anti-Semitism, a vivid reminder, of course, that discrimination against the Jews existed long before the atrocities of World War II. The book also raises questions about marriage and women's rights and explores the ever-present challenges of the Jewish diaspora, particularly the mass exodus of the Jews from Russia. Inspired by the Rothschild dynasty, this sweeping family epic basically reads like the Jewish version of Downton Abbey. As one reviewer noted, Solomons is skilled at showing what big money looked like, smelled like, and even tasted like during the waning years of the Edwardian era. The descriptions are lovingly presented and lead the reader directly into the homes, gardens, and war zones where the story takes place. I included this book in today's presentation because of the gardens. As Natasha Solomons explains, the English are celebrated for our love of gardens, and English writers have always understood that characters reveal themselves through their gardens. The outside spaces in this novel are really explorations of the characters. As Jews, the Goldbaums are passionate about gardens as a result of having been banned from the public parks in Frankfurt. There were no gardens in the ghetto. Now, possessing incredible wealth, they choose to create remarkable and splendid gardens, both to display their power and to remind themselves of how far they've come. According to the author's website, House of Gold has been optioned for a major television adaptation. I've read 2 of Solomon's previous novels, The Gallery of Vanished Husbands and The Song of Heartgrove Hall, but House of Gold is now my favorite by her, and it was really well received by my book groups this fall. And in addition to, for the read-alikes, in addition to Abend and the Stars by Rachel Berenbaum, there's also this new book, The First Mrs. Rothschild by Sarah Aharoni, which is translated from Hebrew, available in English. And it's historical fiction, really more closely following the Rothschild family, specifically the original Rothschild, the couple that kind of started the whole dynasty. It's a thick, dense book, but it's in my read but never finished pile. But maybe some of you would have more patience with it. But House of Gold is more fictionalized. That one seems to take place, and this House of Gold takes place a little later in the family saga of the Rothschilds. So those are the books that I kind of thought of when I was brainstorming this topic of nature and the natural world. I encourage anyone to follow me on Goodreads or Facebook. That's where I post all of my book reviews and what I'm reading. And I'd love to connect with all of you and hear what you're reading. If I don't already know you and you send me a friend request on Facebook, just send me a message that you're from Women's League so I know you're legit. And I'll friend you on either Facebook or Goodreads, and happy to exchange reading recommendations.
Thank you, Rachel. It's always delightful to hear your recommendations, and I also love that you give us those read-alikes. That's fascinating that you could pull all that together. And I do follow you, and you amazingly read so many books and simultaneously always have an audio book at your side at the same time that you're reading a book. So that's fabulous. So I'm going to next call on Susan Farber, and who has a few books for us as well. Susan? Looking for you.
Yes, I know. I did something a little wrong here. I gotta share my screen. And unfortunately, I have this further down than the beginning because I was going through it. But as an intro, when Vivian said we were going to do nature, I thought of it as the beauty of the natural world. So I took it a very different way than Rachel did, and I appreciate Rachel focusing on beautiful descriptions of nature in historical fiction for most of the part. It seemed like to me that's Rachel. Hopefully I was correct in that. So my first book that I'm going to share with you is an interesting book. Rabbi Balfour Brickner was born in Cleveland, and he came to Cincinnati to study at University of Cincinnati, and then he earned his smicha, his ordination at HUC, and he ended up living in New York City at the Stephen Wise Temple or Synagogue in Midtown. He was there a rabbi for a number of years, and he eventually retired in Massachusetts. And he had the tragedy, like some people unfortunately have, of losing a daughter, and it pushed him while he was in New York to have container gardening on his balcony, and as a lot of people are now doing, and then when he had the house in Massachusetts in the backyard. And so this is an interesting way of connecting with nature from a therapeutic perspective for him as well as for many of his congregants over time. So, so that's that story behind that book. And then I also thought, and Vivian was pleased that I wanted to bring this seminal description of the beauty of nature and what's happening to it from the 1950s and 60s. Well, in 1962 it was written. And I put in these two quotes here, and I'll read the longer one. Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. There is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrain of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter. So the patterns of nature and its beauty can reassure us, and I think we need that reassurance in this time when our lives, probably for the near future even, are going to remain very much changed as they are now. I came upon this book, I looked at it, it's a very interesting long form poem or series of long form poems, much like some of the poems we have from England. And if we go back to the idea of William Wordsworth from the late 1700s to 1850 when he died, you know, Wordsworth wrote a lot of poems as he walked, because he walked through the English countryside. And this gentleman, who was an American, Ronald Johnson, he came from Kansas. He went to England for a number of years and lived there, and he eventually came back to Kansas where he died. He was very much inspired, and I thought, aside from him being a cookbook author, it was kind of very interesting how he developed this poetry that is also the rhythm of his writing is kind of reminding you of a pattern of the rhythm of nature. So I thought that was an interesting book. And then for those of us who just want something to look at, to take a trip to nature, this book, which I've not seen, but I'm figuring that any book that's going to have wonderful photographs of outdoor sculpture gardens from around the world, most of which are private, you cannot visit as Mr. Ordinary Person or Miss Ordinary Person. I just thought this would be an interesting coffee table book, or just a book to help you unwind. So this outdoor art. And I'm almost certain that I've been to some sculpture parks in Minneapolis, in The Hague, in here in Cincinnati area, we have a very nice Pyramid Hill sculpture garden. So, and this is a book that I actually borrowed from the public library here. We have a copy of it, this ephemeral work. So this man from Scotland, he literally works really hard to create these rock and stone and ice sculptures in natural settings in Scotland, because he goes there and he sees and he's inspired by what he sees to create art. So, and it's ephemeral because over time nature destroys it. Some of it is with liquids, some of it is with powders, with leaves and petals. So it's very, very interesting what his life, his career has been like as an artist. And I also came across of this, his two movies. They were made by a German artist. And this picture that is from the website about Rivers and Tides, his earlier movie, that's ice. So he's used the freezing waters of Scotland, which he can do. And he's even taken ice blocks and stacked them between branches, trunks of trees. And for these, it's really a remarkable, inspirational piece of artwork that I shared the book at school with my students to give them ideas of what people do. And then from PBS, we all know PBS does a lot of documentary stuff, but this one nature, Crafted America one on nature, was very fascinating. There are 4 artists that use natural elements to create their art. A woman from the Northeast, she's carving wood that she's found, and she sees the shapes evolving from the wood. Another man is using willow twigs and shaping them into structures. So it's very fascinating how these people are creating natural art. And this book on Frederick Law Olmsted's movie, I should say, this documentary from 2014, was also giving you a really strong idea of the beautiful things that Olmsted was inspired to do, not just Central Park in Manhattan, but I grew up in New York City, and I lived for many years in Forest Hills, and he was hired by the first wealthy people who wanted to live in Forest Hills to do the pathways or the roads and all the trees plantings and stuff like that. So he's famous for that too, but he also is in Buffalo and Niagara Falls, has done a lot of landscape design there. And then my last thing that I added today, when I thought about it, this is a 2-hour movie that Wim Wenders created of the Brazilian photographer Sebastian Salgado, who grew up in Brazil and ended up returning to Brazil after living for many years in Paris. And he's written a lot of books of his photograph, of combining his photographs. His wife has done the text for his books on, and he's gone to virtually every continent and photographed the landscapes and what happens over time to this landscape. So that's what I have to share, those few titles.
Thank you.
I hope they're fascinating, and I appreciate your audience today.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Vivian.
Thank you, Susan. I'm so pleased that we're going into all different arts, from landscaping design, tied in with the theme of nature. I just want to add, when you mentioned Silent Spring, that I just remembered something. I first heard of that book and was introduced to it by my 6th grade teacher. And that must have been, I'm doing the math, just within a year of its coming out. It was published in 1962, it was probably 1963. And I had a male, I was unusual in having a male teacher in the 6th grade. And I have very vivid memories from that year, from where everyone in the classroom sat, to having that book introduced to us. And you're indeed correct, that was a seminal book, and it probably started off the organized environmental movement in the United States and led to the first laws that really tried to tackle some of the devastation, environmental devastation. So that's something we can, and people, I don't remember the book well because I last read it in middle school or early high school, but I think I'm gonna read it again. People tell me it's aged very nicely. It's still a beautifully written book and has something to teach us. I'm going to ask if Sandy Carlton is in the room and if she has some books to tell us about. I'm not sure I have a written notes, but I thought she might have. Are you there? And if not, we have it.
She is. She looks as if she's shaking her head no, though.
No,
Yeah,
okay.
I thought we had discussed that this wasn't my genre, and
Okay,
you know,
I
wouldn't participate
misinterpreted.
this time.
Thank you. There was someone who couldn't participate, she meant to, and she sent me in writing. These are so interesting, I have to share it. Marjorie Furman. I just got a message that she's unable to join us, but I'm going to read you 3 books that she recommends. One, and again, this will all be written up, so excuse my mispronunciation of this title. Misty of Chincoteague. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, by Marguerite Henry. It's a children's biography of a horse who lives wild on the Chincoteague Island in North Carolina, Virginia. That straddles North Carolina and Virginia. She learned about this annual roundup and then was through this book It was followed by other books about those horses on the island. It's a wonderful children's story that hasn't aged at all. So you might want to share that with children in your life and read it yourself. The Encyclopedia of Organic Gardening by J.J. Rodale. In his day, Rodale was a famous naturalist. The saddest thing about him is that he died of a heart attack at age 72 while he was a panelist on the Dick Cavett Show. This is the original book that started the organic revolution in America. Interesting. Then there is Moby Duck, the true story of 28,000 bath toys lost at sea by Donovan Hoyne. It was chosen as the New York Times Notable Book of 2011 and was also cited by NPR as the best book. It's a revelatory tale of science, adventure, and modern myth. When writer Donovan Hoyne heard of the mysterious loss of thousands of bath toys at sea, he figured he would ask a few questions and resolve what happened to them. He learns about the shipping conglomerate, the researchers' lives in the Arctic, the role of maverick sailors, and Chinese toy factories. It's a totally readable book that she highly recommends. So thank you in absentia, Marjorie Furman. So I now want to ask. What?
Could you just
we're going to have
repeat the name of that book? Okay, I'll wait, I'll be patient.
Of Chincoteagues. It's a long spelling. Maybe
You can give it to Barbara Ezring and she'll put it together, and then we'll post it on news on our website when we edit the video, which
Nice.
takes a little while.
A couple of children's books. So I want to ask our give you a little time to think. Our participants from Israel and any others who have any writers, Israeli writers they'd like to, who delve into nature in one form or another, to tell us a little bit later. So I'll give you time to think and come back to you about any such books that we haven't covered. I know that Rena Rosner is an Israeli, was Sisters of the Winter Wood, is one Israeli writer, and I welcome any others. But I will in the meantime, talk about a couple of books myself. There is no Jewish connection to either of these books, but Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens was a blockbuster novel published in August 2018 by a zoologist who published before, but this was her first novel. It follows a girl, Kaya, from age 6 through the rest of her life in the marshlands of North Carolina. Abandoned by her mother, then by her father and brothers. By age 6, she's alone, though the alcoholic father and one brother do come back periodically to teach her skills like hunting, fishing, and navigating the waterways by boat. She picks up shellfish from the marsh as her only food at times, is achingly lonely, but she gets a little love and parenting from a kindly Black couple who sell fish at the dock. She learns about life from nature and about people from 2 boys her age, one who is a predator, the other who teaches her to read. When she's 14 years old, she learns to read. She has a curious intellect, and she starts to build an amazingly rich life. However, the townspeople target her as a suspect in a murder. It's a rich story. Some argue that it's implausible. I suggest you read it to decide which, and for its gorgeous depiction of the marsh. And it tells you how a naturalist would do her work. And it's an exciting story. It's partly a coming of age story, part mystery, part about the human urge to go beyond mere survival and to live intellectually. And there's going to be a film coming out with Reese Witherspoon as the producer. So Flight Behavior is a novel by Barbara Kingsolver. Kingsolver has lived in both Appalachia, Tennessee, and in the Southwest, and she's written novels set in both places. Her earlier works were Prodigal Summer, The Bean Trees, and The Poisonwood Bible. In The Flight Behavior, she again has a feisty woman main character. She is from the white underclass, trapped in a loveless marriage after a teenage pregnancy in a dead-end community. But at age 27, she stumbles on a mountaintop full of overwintering monarch butterflies who lost their way going to Mexico because climate change upset their compass. The press and a scientist converge on her town because she doesn't quite fit into the church-centered culture, and she has a curious mind. She is drawn to the scientist who comes into town to study the butterflies. Soon her life's possibilities start to open up. Now, Kingsolver's novels are rooted in her passionate beliefs about the environmental assaults by industry and government. And she also talks about gender, class, and racial injustices. She features strong women characters, worked into the story without ever becoming a lecture. Her depiction of nature is stunningly lyrical, as with the Crawdads novel as well. You'll care about the woman character in its midst. So with that, I'd like to return to anyone who has any other books by Israeli writers. I welcome to speak by raising your hand or unmuting yourself. And if you send me an email after this session is over, I'll include it in books. I see Diane has her.
To tell you that I don't actually know of a book. I wish I'd sort of thought about it ahead of time. The only thing I would say is that living in Israel, you have a very, very strong feeling that the environment is not a theoretical topic, because the country is so small. If you just take from my house and you drive about 40 minutes, you'll be at the beginning of the Dead Sea, and it is horrifying. If anybody remembers being in Israel like 15 years ago, and to drive there now, you just see all this land instead of the water.
There's no sea.
So it's very, very real. And I would like to look into if there are books that are written. I don't know of any, but just saying the environment is with us every day. The fears about it.
Diane. I mentioned at the beginning of this that I have two daughters who are both journalists, and they both have specialties in environmental science. So I think my daughter Rebecca has joined us now. Is that correct?
Hi,
Rebecca?
yeah.
Hi, there you are. Welcome. Rebecca is based in Washington, D.C., and she's a writer, reporter for Mother Jones magazine. And Rebecca has a couple of books to present to us. She's part of a book club, an avid reader. We talk about books all the time. Do you want to tell everyone what Mother Jones magazine is for a moment and what you do? And then tell us about your books.
Yeah, so Mother Jones is a magazine. I think it's been around since the 70s, and we focus on politics, some culture, environmental issues. So we're in print and online. I write about climate change and environment, so I do a lot of reading on that. And so my mom asked me for some recommendations. I actually happen to have all the books at home. So I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, but I guess one of the books I read it a few years ago called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard. And it's a nonfiction book. She won the Pulitzer Prize for it. It's basically a series of essays and reflections on her, she lived in the woods, I guess, for a year, and she kind of takes you through the seasons in the woods. And it's a really interesting kind of reflection on nature. I actually found myself after reading it paying closer attention just to the nature around me. And I live in a city, but just that like little things catch your eye. And just being more aware of your surroundings. So it's very poetic and beautiful writing. She wrote it in 1974. So it's, I think, has some lasting power. And I guess I'll go on to the next book. Is that?
Sure.
So another book I read a few years ago, Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert. She's this came out in 2014, and that's what it looks like. So I'm not sure if anyone has read it, but it was kind of, when it came out, it was this instant classic. It's a nonfiction book about loss of biodiversity and about climate change. And I think it's a really good, both a good primer on climate science and also just really easy to understand and relatable. I think her writing, so she's a New Yorker staff writer, her writing on climate for the last 20 years has been really seminal for around this issue. She won a Pulitzer Prize for this book, and it's basically about how we are losing a lot of biodiversity today, and we are in we're probably in the sixth mass extinction in all of history. So it takes like you through the history of life in the world. So I think it has a really long-term focus, and it's a few years out of date, but I think it's still really relatable. And the third book is fiction. So Anne Patchett, she's so this is called State of Wonder. You've maybe read Anne Patchett on some other for her other books. She's a very popular author. She wrote Bel Canto. And this book I thought had it's a novel, but it really connects the environment to the plot. So it's about the basic plot, without giving too much away, it's very suspenseful, is a doctor and researcher goes to the Amazon, like deep into the jungle, to research a cure for malaria. And they're completely off the map for this. And it kind of, it like presents the nature as both like a opportunity and like point of conflict, that there's a lot of focus on insects and the diseases they carry, but also the beauty of nature and the cures that nature can have for all of various ills and health problems. So I think the way that it's set in a jungle, that kind of really, I think that's where the environmental theme really comes through. And it's also just a really interesting and fast read, similar to her other novels. So that one came out in 2011. So that's also not the newest release. So yeah, those were, I guess, those were the books that I had to recommend.
Thank you. I just finished Anne Patchett's The Dutch House. That was another one of her popular books. Thank you,
Yeah,
Rebecca. I
Okay.
now will go right. Thank you for that. Right now, I have my other daughter. We have 3 daughters. So Rebecca's the youngest, and now Jessica Lieber is our oldest, and she is a senior editor at Audubon magazine, which, as you know, is known for its being covering the natural world and especially birds, but way beyond that, and having advocacy points of view too. So Jessica, I think Jessica's another avid book enthusiast, and I'd like to welcome you.
Hi, Mom. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Brooklyn. She's based in Brooklyn.
So I would love to present 3 books. I don't have them in front of me because I'm a big ebook reader, but I will put links to them in the chat after this. I realized after I picked these 3 books, they are all about plants. So that is the theme. So the first I have to recommend is called The Signature of All Things. It's a historical fiction novel by Elizabeth Gilbert that came out in 2013. And you might know her name. She's most famous, or some people think she's actually infamous for her memoir Eat, Pray, Love. She inspires this love-hate feeling based on that one book. And when I suggested it to my own book club, a few people rolled their eyes, but then they all ended up loving it. It's definitely one of my favorite works of fiction in the last 5 years. It takes place in the 1800s and follows the life of a heroine named Alma Whitaker, who's this unconventional woman who is born into wealth in Philadelphia. She's educated and she cultivates her own deep curiosity about the natural world around her, and ends up studying plants, particularly species of mosses all around her. So you kind of learn way more about mosses in this book than you ever thought you'd want to know, but you will enjoy it. The larger theme of it is basically talking about the process of scientific discovery about the natural world during the Enlightenment, this era where Darwin also developed his own theories about evolution. But what's interesting about Alma is she doesn't have to leave her home to learn about the natural world and discover new ideas. And that's something I feel like we all can relate to today because we're at home. So I really love this book. It's just a fantastic and quick read. The second book I will recommend is called The Overstory by Richard Powers. I'm actually about 2/3 of the way through it right now, so it's pretty fresh in my mind. It's a novel that came out in 2018 and won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction that year. It has really strong themes around environmentalism, and it intertwines the stories of 9 very different characters whose lives have been influenced by their unique relationship with trees. So kind of the 10th main character in the book are trees themselves. He really gives voice to what trees need, and they're we kind of learn through the book how tree lives kind of outlast our own human ones, and they connect to human lives in surprising ways. The characters in the book, they all have different journeys, and some of them are working to protect old growth redwood trees from logging on the West Coast. And the book takes place in the late 1990s, which is when a lot of these real battles were reaching a height. If this sounds a little cheesy, when you actually read it, it's not. He's just such a great descriptive author, and it makes you really relate to trees through different eyes by reading it. Okay, and then the last book I will suggest is called The Pine Barrens by John McPhee. This is nonfiction. I was assigned to read it in a class during my master's degree in environmental journalism about 10 years ago. John McPhee, maybe you've heard of him. He's an incredible journalist and writer, has won many prizes over many decades. He's kind of known for his obsessive attention to detail with really obscure subjects. He's written books about geology and obscure forms of transportation, but he has this really great way of making details interesting, and you would start to care about things you never had any interest before. So The Pine Barrens is one of his early books. It was written in 1968. It's pretty short. It's basically focuses on this region of New Jersey that I never knew about called the Pine Barrens. It's southern New Jersey. It's not far from the Jersey Turnpike and like all the dense suburbs in New Jersey, but it's actually surprisingly rural and insular, and it's dominated by these amazing untouched forests and these unique communities that have kind of lived there for generations in like relative isolation, considering where they are in such a dense part of the country. So it's a work of journalism. He writes about the region's unique culture, and there are characters, several people who have lived there. And you hear about how they live off the ecosystem and their natural products like blueberries and cranberries. He writes about emerging development threats there too. So it's a really interesting portrait of a place. And a lot of nature writing is really tied to place, and he does that so well. So you really feel you're transported there. And It was written in the late 60s, so it kind of makes me wonder what the Pine Barrens are like now, like whether they are still so isolated and unique. I actually don't know, so maybe I should take a trip there. Anyway, and those are my 3 recommendations. I will put some links to these books in the chat now. So yeah, thank you, Mom.
Okay, thank you. That was very, very good. Thank you to both my daughters. I'm so proud of you. So I see that people from the chats, from the chat boxes, I see people are mentioning some other books. I'd like to invite some of them to mention out aloud some of the books that they're talking about in the chat box. So who would like to do that?
I'm calling in from Israel, Naomi Gretz.
Hi, Naomi.
I mentioned one of the books, the Overstory, which I agree is an amazing book. I actually finished it, and it's a fabulous book. But you asked for an Israeli suggestion before, and I think David Grossman's To the End of the Land has an amazing description of the land, because in dealing with the tragedy and her postponing finding out about the death of her son, and which, you know, it was very tragic, because I think it was written before or after David Grossman lost his son in the army. But anyway, that's irrelevant at the moment. You have a description of the land and traveling all over the land from where they're living and escaping into the land, and it's almost part of the plot, and going deeper and deeper into the land. And then another book, which is also an amazing book, Helen McDonald's H is for Hawk.
Yes.
I don't know if any of you read that, which is, it's an autobiographical book of how she managed to get through some of her problems by training this hawk. And you have a whole description of you know, man and birds and nature, and women actually, and nature and birds and training, and it's an amazing descriptive book, and very exciting book to read, even though it's nonfiction. So those were my 3 suggestions. I think I had a 4th one, but I don't remember what it was. So that was it. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. Does anyone else have a book they want to recommend? If you meant, whether you put it in the chat box or didn't.
Yes, I have. First of all, I want to say that Pine Barrens are still there. They're on the way to the Jersey Shore. Some periodically there are fires that decimate, and then nature repairs itself and they come back again. But I also have a book that I'd like to recommend. It's called Paradise on the Hudson. It's about the Untermeyer Gardens. It's in Yonkers, New York, for anybody that's in the New York area. But it's fascinating because this guy was a lawyer, the first person, I think, to win $1 million verdict in the United States. He's a Jewish lawyer, but his passion was his gardens, and particularly his walled gardens. And it's the story of the creation, loss, and revival of the American garden. And I recommend it. Paradise on the Hudson.
Thank you.
And I recommend that you go there if you live nearby.
We're covering many regions. Anyone from another part of the country that has a book
Arlene
that...
had her hand up, so I don't know if she just wrote it in the chat or she wanted to speak, but you're unmuted.
Yeah, no, just very briefly, I just finished a book that I read with my 2 granddaughters, and we're going to have a discussion about it actually soon. Watership Down by Richard Adams. It's a classic. It's from 1972. But I very seldom have ever read a book where the description of the countryside is just absolutely amazing in southern England. And basically, it's just, everybody know about Watership Down? Has anybody not heard of it? Nobody? Well, it is. I'll just tell you briefly. It's basically a survival and adventure story of a group of rabbits, but it can be read almost like an allegory of what happens to a society. What happens, you know, the rabbits are almost like a human, they have human features. He anthropomorphizes the rabbit. So it's really a fascinating story. And they encounter a very totalitarian culture. And then you see the contrast. But the author's, the way he describes the Southern English countryside is just amazing. The amount of detail, it's really quite beautiful, actually. And the way he talks about the animals and how they survive in contrast to, you know, the things that prey on them, like other animals and human beings. So it's really a very interesting novel to think about. When I thought right away, I thought about it when you talked about nature. That just came to mind.
Thank you for reminding us.
And
of
another
that.
one, actually, I thought about. You talked about Israeli writers. In terms of the description of Israel, it's a very long, kind of a tough book to get through, but it's very rewarding. It's Shai Agnon's Only Yesterday, and it's the descriptions of Israel at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. It's really quite amazing. You know, the cultural aspects and the physical aspects of the country are amazing. It is a classic. It's a classic in Israel, Shai Agnon's Only Yesterday, but it's about that thick. And it's not easy, but you do learn a tremendous amount about what was going on in the country, you know, in those early years of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you, Arlene. I think we'll have time for just one more if anyone else has a book to recommend. I might mention that our Torah is a wonderful source too for nature writing.
So I want to highly recommend, having just finished teaching Shir HaShirim, I highly recommend everyone should read Shir HaShirim and look at the nature, and then go Google pictures in Shir HaShirim, and you'll see, and music in Shir HaShirim, and you'll find videos of classic songs, and you'll find them accompanied with beautiful pictures of nature. And you know, Chagall loved it. You know, Chagall loved Shir HaShirim. He had a whole series. So I highly recommend that you read it looking at nature. There's plenty of other things to look for, but nature is wonderful.
That was the first book of the Bible I thought of when you said nature, was Shir HaShirim.
Thank you. That was important to mention. I also want to mention that we have I think we concluded the poetry series with Sarah Stern. Is that correct?
Until maybe after they'll pick it up again probably in July or so.
So the poets that she covered in that series, which you can find on the Women's League website, also so much poetry touches on nature. So we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the books. We didn't even talk about poetry today, of the books that, the literature that is tied in with nature, the natural world. So we can only, and I also wanted to, if we had time, which we didn't, talk about some of the founding fathers and mothers. We did talk about Rachel Carlson, but some of the others for nature and nature writing. So thank you to everyone. This was really a lot of very peaceful kind of topic, one that we really can't forget, and one that ties in with Lag BaOmer very well. I'd like to make mention that Barbara Ezring is doing us the favor of recording all the books that we've discussed. Well, in a few days, we'll have a list, and I will share it with those who request it, or if you've requested in the past, I will automatically send it to you. Our next planned session is Tuesday, May 26th, the day after Memorial Day. We will then discuss murders, mysteries, and spies, fiction and nonfiction. So we'll try to find the Jewish angle in that too, but we don't have to in every book. If you would like to present a book in that category, send me a line by email and we'll plan together. My email, Leber, Leber, @WLCJ.org. And everyone, please stay safe and please stay well and enjoy the Chag. And Rabbi, do you have anything to say in conclusion to our session?
Well, I want to thank all of you for presenting and for Vivian to organize this. Thank you so much. It's So inspiring. I have to say that these sessions cost me a lot of money afterwards because you can't go to the library to take the books out, and somehow my library doesn't have any of them online. So my mother and I sit and say, okay, which ones are you going to order? Which ones are I'm going to order? So thank you. It's really incredible. If I ever move back to Chicago, not that I plan, I'm going to come to Rachel's house and raid her library. So thank you all. Check Women's League Reads for more of our activities and our website as well.